Hi everyone, I'm Miles. If anyone's new to this channel, I've been doing breakdowns track by track for Elliott Smith albums, starting with Self-Titled, and the Either Or breakdown is coming up, but I wanted to record a little video while I was finishing those. I've actually been thinking about doing this video for a little while. I don't know if any of you caught Anthony Fantano's Elliott Smith album tier list. Thought it was really interesting. He shared a lot of his subjective opinions. He had some very interesting opinions, and I think some areas where he maybe missed a couple things. I wanted to make a video as a musician, as someone who's dove into Elliott Smith's music pretty deeply at this point, to offer some corrections to some of what Anthony Fantano's saying. Just a reminder that we made a songbook containing tabs and chords for every song in the Self-Titled album based on the work I did on each video in the series. And by the time this video comes out, the digital version will finally be available as well. There are links below in the description. Everyone who buys a hard copy or who has already bought one will also get a digital version, and I'll coordinate all that through the Etsy store. I've kept these prices as low as possible, and obviously the videos I made are free for everyone to watch and learn from. Alright, without further ado, let's get into this tier list. Starting with Elliott Smith's debut solo album, Roman Candle. This album is the first of his I listened to. Anyone who's followed the channel might have heard me mention that when I first heard Elliott Smith's music, I went sequentially. I started with Roman Candle, and I went through one album at a time, and I fell in love with his music immediately through this first album. I think some of his most interesting songwriting actually lands on this album. His solo career started when he was about 24, and at this point he'd already been writing music for, I think, a little more than 10 years. So some of the songs on this album are many years in the making, and I think you can really hear that. His guitar skills at this point were already phenomenal. And not only had he been writing music for years, but he'd also been doing home recordings similar to this album for years as well, which is where he developed that signature style of the panned voices and the kind of quiet, angry sound in his voice. I think guitar parts like Condor Avenue are some of the most incredible guitar parts that he has ever written. In Fantano's video, I think he placed this album in the C tier, and this is, Fantano's biggest mistake, I think, in the video. There is some lower audio quality on this album, but especially with the remaster that Larry Crane recently did, I think this album absolutely stands up and shines through with some of the greatest songwriting I've ever heard. It absolutely stands up as one of the best albums, best singer-songwriter albums in existence. I think this absolutely deserves its spot in the S tier. All right, moving on now to Elliott Smith's self-titled album from 1995. His sophomore record is very similar to Roman Candle. A lot of the same very intense, raw and beautiful lyrics, many incredible detailed guitar parts, a lot of really imaginative chord choices, and his own unique chord shapes exist throughout all the tracks on this album. Obviously, I've shared thoughts at length on each track on this album. Something that's really important to point out is when this album came out, Nirvana was starting to reshape the music scene, certainly the rock scene at the time, with the heavier sound. And Elliott Smith came through on this record and later ones with a sound that was much softer and more stripped back, but in many ways just as intense or more intense than that music. Each of these songs, just like on Roman Candle, stand up to any in the singer-songwriter genre. Fantano put this in the S, and I think this is where he absolutely nailed it. This album as well would definitely be an S tier album. All right. Now we have 1997's Either Or. This was Elliott Smith's breakout album. It corresponded with his collaboration with Gus Van Sant on the movie Good Will Hunting. And his song Miss Misery, which he ended up being nominated for an Oscar for, maybe more than any other songwriter I've heard. He can make so much texture and depth with just a guitar and his voice, even if there's some multi-tracking going on. We got some standout tracks on this album, like Between the Bars. Say Yes is one of the most beautiful Elliott Smith melodies that I've ever heard, and paired with heartbreaking lyrics that, as always, see through to the most vulnerable places of people's emotions when it comes to relationships and love and loss and longing. For many people, this album is the best Elliott Smith album, their favorite. Again, a lot of people discovered Elliott Smith initially through this, and I think it does have a very unique place in his discography of a point of transition between the more raw and DIY sound on his first two albums towards his bigger budget and more ornate instrumental arrangements on later albums like XO and Figure 8. But in its form, I think it captures something very special. I think this album is extremely unique, jam-packed full of great songs. Fantano put this album in the B tier, and I think that was pretty close to where it should be. Goddamn. I think that was pretty close to correct, but clearly he underrated this one a little bit, considering its impact in terms of Elliott Smith's career, how much it stands out within the genre of singer-songwriter albums, of rock albums, whatever genre qualification you want to put it. And I think it definitely deserves its place as an S-tier album as well, of course. This is an iconic album. Many people's favorites. I don't think necessarily his best, but definitely just as good as the previous three. And now we've got Elliott Smith's first major label album, XO. He recorded this with DreamWorks and was able to have a much bigger budget. This album is definitely not as stripped back as his first three. I think the first track is a very interesting example of this right from the gate. He addresses this almost directly through the music. Sweet Adelaide starts with just the voice and guitar, which people came to know, although with a beautiful, clear recording quality that is one of the things that makes this album so special. It might be the clearest recording quality sound of any Elliott Smith album, which I'll get into later. And on Sweet Adelaide, his voice and his guitar feel familiar but static until it explodes into the chorus with descending arpeggios and crazy chord movement. This album sees Elliott Smith make full use of that bigger budget and the opportunity to record more layers. We have saxophones on this album, trumpets, French horns, flutes. He was able to play many instruments, and on his previous albums, he played almost every instrument you hear. But on this album, he was able to bring in studio musicians to fill out some of his grander ideas for arrangements. And he also used the opportunity for clean, immaculate recordings to track some of his most accessible and catchy and iconic songs of his career, including Waltz No. 2. But he did all this without sacrificing the beautiful, soft intensity of a song like Pizzala. So while this album was divisive at the time, I think in retrospect it clearly shines through as a pretty remarkable achievement in his career to be able to go from such an indie and DIY aesthetic on the first three albums. He made that transition more seamlessly than a lot of smaller artists do when they get the big record deal. And the ambitions were, of course, just the first step of the later sonic experimentation he would engage in. But it's an incredible achievement. And in terms of all the iconic songs that you see on this album and the beautiful recording quality, which he was able to have through working with bigger studios and with people like John Bryan, again, all the studio musicians he worked with as well. Anthony Fantano put this album in the A tier, and I think that is underrating it a little bit. I think, again, objectively speaking, this album definitely stands up to his first four and definitely deserves a place in the S tier. Now we have the final album that was released during Elliott Smith's life. This is Figure 8. Everyone who is a big fan of Elliott Smith has probably heard him talk about his affinity for the Beatles and Britpop. This album, he was able to actually record partly at Abbey Road Studios, which is a cool detail. And I think it really stands as his clearest tribute to that style of music. The pop sensibilities are on full display here, but he's also able to use more sonic experimentation. Yeah, this album absolutely rocks. Son of Sam has got to be one of his most incredible guitar parts, and it's one of many of his songs that in his later years that sound incredible on the record, again, in this case with full rock instrumentation and incredible layering. but he would play them live with just the guitar and his voice, and it would be just as beautiful to listen to in that context as well. And by this point, I think it was really becoming clear that Elliott Smith was an artist that was never going to stop evolving. It's pretty incredible when you look at the progression of his style through his records. Even from Roman Candle to Self-Titled, there's a clear evolution, if not in the recording style, certainly in the approach to the songwriting. But each successive album saw him reinterpret his own voice. And this record, I think, is one of the most consistent sounding out of all 5 of his records up to this point, even though it uses all the different sounds. So while XO is maybe a bit of a buffet with an enormous range and all the instruments that Elliott Smith could have thought to use, on this record we see a more focused approach. And a lot of people, I think, underrate this album significantly, but this is an instance where I think Anthony Fantano nailed the rating. It is definitely, as I think he says, unfuckwithable. This album rocks. And definitely deserves its place in the S tier. All right, now to wrap things up, we have the first of 2 posthumous releases. This is From a Basement on the Hill. This record was arguably mostly finished, maybe half finished at the time of Elliott Smith's death, and was taken over the finish line by his collaborators at the time. I have heard a lot of divisive opinions about this album. We've lost a lot of the sonic clarity of XO and Figure 8, and it's replaced by a very intense, heavy, raw and distorted and messy at times sound to the entire album. I recorded a full reaction to this album on the channel if you want to watch that, but that pretty much captured my initial impression, and the album has only grown on me since then. I think this album takes all the sonic experimentation of Figure 8 with its sheen and kind of dreamy, removed perspective and slams it right into your face, exploding the sounds, layering drums, layering voice, layering distorted guitars, but again, without losing the essence of what makes his writing so great, which is just really beautiful, minimal but intricate guitar parts and vocal melodies as well as lyrics. And the one that hit me the hardest on first listen, A Fond Farewell, again, mostly just guitar and voice on that track, and it is absolutely heartbreaking. One of the most heartbreaking depictions of addiction and the attempt to get clean. And obviously there's a lot of heavy emotions that go along with the listen of this record, knowing that it came towards the end of his life. But it was clear that even through all the struggles he was going through personally, it did not diminish his creativity one bit. And I think this album is absolutely underappreciated and should be given many more listens. It has, I think, in some ways, the best of all the eras of his career. The experimentation of Figure 8, the time and the budget that he was afforded for XO, as well as, of course, the rawness that was present on his earlier albums and the lyrics that just cut right to the bone, as well as the delivery. So this is absolutely one of his best albums and stands in line with all of his previous. I think this definitely deserves a place in the S tier. Oh, interesting. Guess we have to adjust this to make some room. So while Fantano placed this, I think, in the C tier, we definitely know, I think, objectively where it should go. That leaves us with his final album. Of course, this was another posthumous release of music recorded mostly during the time he was recording Self-Titled and Either Or. And again, a lot of great songs on here. I have a reaction to this album on the channel. It's interesting. Usually a sort of anthology record like this might suffer in quality, right? These were songs that Elliott Smith chose not to release, at least on the albums that came out during his life. They didn't fit in. And for a lot of songwriters, this might be because the songwriting was weak, or the ideas weren't fleshed out. But as I think Larry Crane said, who helped compile this record, Elliott Smith's throwaways are still better than some musicians' main catalog. And on this record, I think you can see that the progression from album to album that we see through the 5 albums that came out during his life, as well as from A Basement on the Hill, his last real studio effort, that clear evolution in his sound, constant experimentation in line with the greatest musicians like Fiona Apple, David Bowie, Prince, who reinvented themselves with each new album, not as a gimmick, but just as a natural evolution of themselves as an artist, using different tools at their disposal at different times in their career, writing about where they are in their life. And this album is just a beautiful image of, again, some of the greatest music that has been recorded, certainly in the singer-songwriter genre. He was just writing too much music for a standard album release cycle, which, you know, might take a year or 2 years, especially as he's, with each new release, moving on to, you know, better studios, different collaborators, people like John Bryan that he was working with. He was evolving as he went. And so a lot of these tracks got left behind, but are still some of his most incredible writing. Songs like Whatever Folk Song in C is just an incredibly simple and beautiful song, and could have easily fit on the self-titled record. So this record is, again, just more of the same incredible quality. I think you know where this is going. This is an anthology, so it belongs in the S tier. Yeah, and I think this, again, Fantano's video, it's definitely worth checking out. Go ahead and do so if you haven't. I think this is just a bit more of an objective perspective here. Again, as a musician, someone who's dove into his music, I think we can see how these albums all stack up, and this is my tier list of Elliott Smith albums. I'm curious what you all think. Please leave your thoughts in the comments. And I'll see you all soon for the either or track by track breakdown. Thanks for watching. See you soon.